Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into some truly fascinating data that tracks a massive shift in social and economic dynamics. We're looking at the journey of women in Bangladesh and observing how they've transitioned from, largely confined domestic roles to literally becoming a primary driver of a national economy. So let's break down exactly how this happened. Right out of the gate, we've got to look at the baseline. And this isn't some recent development either. This is Article 28.2 of the Constitution of Bangladesh, drafted right after the nation's independence back in 1971. This single sentence laid the absolute legal and moral foundation for everything we're about to unpack today. It set a standard that, while it did take decades to fully realize, gave the necessary legal leverage for the massive shifts that followed. To wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of this shift, we've divided this explainer into 5 key areas: the historical context, laws and policies, economic transformation, rising political power, and finally, the changing social fabric. Let's jump straight into part 1, the historical context, moving from invisible to visible. Look at Bangladesh prior to the 1980s. The vast majority of women's labor was, well, it was essentially invisible. It was strictly confined to the home or to unpaid agricultural work, and it went completely unrecognized in formal economic data. Women were managing households, raising kids, doing heavy post-harvest labor, but actually it wasn't even considered work in the traditional economic sense. But post-independence, and really accelerating through the late 80s and 90s, we see this dramatic pivot. We transition from invisible labor right into highly visible, formal, public sphere participation. Women literally began stepping out of the courtyards and into the factories, offices, and public institutions. Which brings us to part 2, laws and policies, the real catalysts for change. Looking at this legal timeline, you can see how a framework of protection and empowerment was built up over the decades. It kicks off with that constitutional guarantee in 1972, followed by the landmark 1997 National Women Development Policy, which actively took aim at systemic inequalities. Then, fast forward to 2010 with the Domestic Violence Act, which was absolutely crucial for ensuring safety within the home, and the revised 2011 policy that cemented these rights even further. The big takeaway here? These rights weren't just theoretical ideals left on a piece of paper. They were systematically turned into actionable, protective legislation. So, how did that impact the real world? Let's look at part 3, the economic transformation powering the nation. 80%. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the proportion of female workers in the Bangladeshi ready-made garments, or RMG sector. We are talking about roughly 2.62 million women who shifted from the informal, unpaid economy straight into the formal, wage-earning economy. And look, these women aren't just earning a paycheck. They're getting financial independence, they're delaying early marriages, and they're literally powering the export engine of the entire country. When you think of the modern Bangladeshi economy, you're absolutely thinking of the labor of these millions of women. But wait, we can't let the immense visibility of those urban garment workers obscure the broader picture. Data from the International Labor Organization reveals a completely different reality on the ground. A massive 77% of the female workforce remains rooted in rural areas, primarily doing agricultural work. So while the urban landscape has transformed at lightning speed, the vast majority of working women in Bangladesh are still deeply tied to the land. And here's where things get kind of tricky. We call this the agricultural paradox. Women are doing a staggering 79% of the agricultural work. We're talking everything from seed preparation to post-harvest processing, yet men hold 81% of the land ownership. Add to that some severe daily wage disparities where women are paid significantly less than men for the exact same manual labor. And yeah, it really highlights that while participation has absolutely skyrocketed, true equity in ownership and compensation out in the rural areas still has a really long way to go. Let's pivot to part 4, rising political power and administration. In the political arena, the 1997 Local Government Act was a total game changer. By reserving 3 seats specifically for women in every single union parishad, which is the lowest tier of local government there, the state pulled rural women directly into the mechanics of local governance. This wasn't just tokenism either. It meant thousands of women suddenly had a literal seat at the table. They were making decisions about local budgets, infrastructure, community justice, fundamentally altering the traditional male-dominated power dynamics of the village. And if you look at the national level, the data from the 31st to the 35th Bangladesh Civil Service, or BCS exams, backs this up perfectly. The steady rise in female representation across these cohorts shows women securing a significant growing chunk of elite administrative roles. They're no longer just the subjects of administration, They are actively integrating into the core machinery of the state, working as magistrates, police officers, and top-tier civil servants. Finally, let's wrap up with part 5, the changing social fabric and how boundaries are being broken. Because honestly, the traditional mold has been completely shattered. Decades ago, society dictated very, very narrow professions for women. But today, women have boldly entered non-traditional, highly visible, and super demanding roles. You've got women thriving in the military and law enforcement, commanding respect in journalism, and breaking major stereotypes in heavy industries like aviation and mechanical engineering. That old psychological barrier of what constitutes women's work, yeah, it's been completely dismantled. So, while the progress over the last 50 years is undeniable and honestly deeply inspiring, I want to leave you with this to chew on. We're looking at a dual reality in Bangladesh today. On one hand, you have the empowered, financially independent urban professional, the civil servant, the garment worker. But on the other, you have the rural agricultural laborer who works tirelessly, owns no land, and gets lower wages. How does a society bridge this massive gap? How does a nation ensure that the constitutional promise of equality reaches every single woman, no matter where she lives? It's a hugely complex challenge, for sure. But understanding the data we've explored today is the very first step. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the numbers.